Appreciate you stepping in today to lead us in worship as well. Well, have you ever experienced or had an experience in your life where something happened and your response to it is to say, man, I wish I could just die. Just get this out of the way. She's not here today, so I'm going to tell a story on Linda. It's better to ask forgiveness later than to ask permission. But we had just married. I'd graduated from Bible college. She was still in school, and we were living in Houston. We'd only been married about 2 months. I got a phone call. We got our first invitation to come interview at a church. Now, I'm not going to tell you where it was because it didn't go well, all right? But we set it up. We got on an airplane. We flew to the destination, well, actually to a major city, and then they picked us up and they took us to this small town, small church that was looking for a youth pastor. So after the obligatory tour of the town, which took about 20 minutes, I mean, it's a small town, we went to the church and we sat down with their board. Now understand, I'm looking at this with all kinds of excitement and enthusiasm because I see this as the first step, my first opportunity to really begin to impact the lives of young people. And I was also selfishly looking at it as the first rung of the ladder for me to start making a name for myself. So here we sit. And right off the bat, the board lays out for us their financial proposal. They very proudly declared to us that they are ready to pay us $10,000 a year to come and join the church staff. Now this is 1977. So $10,000 probably wasn't a bad start for somebody, this just beginning. I wouldn't recommend it today. But anyway, they're talking about the proposal. That $10,000 included housing. And I'm thinking, we could do that. And then they said, while we're at it, we want to talk to you about your wife's role, as if she's not sitting right here. They said, we know she's still in school. And so we are willing to allow her the opportunity to continue her education. But we want her to be available to help you at any and every opportunity. So therefore, she cannot take a job outside of the church. They obviously did not know my wife. You see, Linda has always been a very independent thinker. And she has always been outspoken when she needed to be. Now, she's mellowed, as have I, over the years. But when they said that she was forbidden to work outside of the home, she leaned forward in her chair, looked these men straight in the eye, and said, "It sounds to me like you're wanting to hire two for the price of one." I suddenly realized that we would not be coming to this church. And if she were here this morning, I would have to take her out to dinner after church. Now, I'm going to admit, in that immediate moment, I was a little embarrassed because I didn't expect that kind of boldness from her. But as I look back at that situation, and as time has passed, I understand that her discernment and her willingness to speak her mind really saved us from getting into what was going to be a terrible situation. But for a moment there, I just wanted to die. But my feelings were nothing in comparison to what Job was going through. In the midst of all of his sorrow and all of his suffering, he wanted to die. He not because he was embarrassed, not at all. He wanted to get out of the pain and out of the suffering that he was in because it was overwhelming him. This wasn't funny. And Job felt like if I could just die, I could get it over with. Now look at this. Job's entire life has just gone up in smoke. Satan has really burned him, and the devil has inflicted him with trouble and with adversity in a way that you and I could never even begin to fathom. I mean, remember what he's been through. His possessions have all been stolen from him. His fortune has been reduced to pennies. His entire family, save his wife, has been brutally ripped from his heart. And if that's not enough, now Satan, with clearance from God, mind you, has blistered him from the top of his head to the soles of his feet with these painful, weeping sores. Job is a man who has just been financially, physically, and emotionally bankrupted. He's been completely devastated. Now, don't forget this. When the first wave of attacks came against him, Job's response was a response of faith. He said in Job 1 and 21, I came naked from my mother's womb, and I'll be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord. Wow. But the onslaughts have continued. And now, he's at a point where his strength is beginning to fail, and his soul is slowly being consumed. I mean, after all, let's remember something. Job is human. And the compounding effects of all of this suffering is beginning to wear on him, and Job's down. He's discouraged, and he's just about ready to just throw in the towel. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever been there? Have you ever suffered such pain that you wish you could just die and go on to heaven? I know I have, and the truth is, every person has a breaking point. Every one of us has a red line that when we cross that line into discouragement, it sometimes takes us into deep depression. See, I'm talking about the kind of despair that makes you just want to give up. Oh, Jesus, let your second coming be today. Come and get me out of all of this. The weight of these trials and the tribulations, I can't stand anymore. And in spite of your best efforts, the pain just won't go away. I want to tell you something. That's where Job is. And he's saying, if I could just find some relief, any relief, but finding none, he just wanted his life to be over. Just move on to the next. Now I want you to understand something. Job was not suicidal. He was not considering or even thinking about taking his own life. But he was wishing that God would take it. So here we find him. Job has not much life left in him. All he's got is pain, sorrow, torment, suffering, misery. And that's not much to live for, is it? When you think about it. Oh God, I just wish you'd do something. Just get me out of this. You know, there's an old saying, be careful what you wish for. Well, you know, Job came up with his own wish list in this situation. And I want you to look at these with me. Here was the first one. I wish I'd never been born. I mean, you talk about somebody that is going through the dark throes, through the throes of the dark night of the soul. We're going to pick up where we stopped the story last week. Job has been severely afflicted, and he has been afflicted for weeks, probably months. And whatever the time frame, it's been long enough that Job's faith is starting to erode. He's beginning to go down that road of depression. And about this time, 3 of his friends arrive. And finding him almost unrecognizable, the 3 of them sit down with him in silence. And they just sit for 7 days waiting for Job to speak. Remember, we talked about this last week. And then finally, and it begins with chapter 3, Job opens his mouth. At last, Job spoke. And he cursed the day of his birth. He said, "Let the day of my birth be erased and the night I was conceived." Job was in the darkest place he had ever been in. His entire life. He had never been this down. And he's literally saying, I wish I'd never been born. I mean, I wish I'd never existed because of what I'm having to go through right now. And he was ready, and he's willing to give up. He was ready. He would have welcomed death. He's saying it was a sad day that I was even conceived. And if there was some way that we could go back and just eradicate my existence, it would be better. God, just go back in time and take that date off the calendar. Just annihilate the whole day for that matter. Because if that day never existed, then all of this misery that I'm in would have never come about. I mean, Job's in a bad place. But you know what? He still hasn't hit the bottom of his despair yet. And I can't help but think that while Job is saying this, and while these words are coming out of his mouth, overhears the devil, and he's thinking to himself, you know what? I've just about got him. He's almost to that place where he's going to curse God before much more takes place. Well, Job continues, verse 4. He says, "Let that day be turned to darkness. Let it be lost even to God on high, and let no light shine from it. Let the darkness and utter gloom claim that day for its own. Let a black cloud overshadow it, and let the darkness terrify it. Let that night be blotted off the calendar, never again to be counted among the days of the year, never again to appear among the months." 3 verses, 5 times Job talks about darkness, blackness, and dark gloom. You know why? Because this is what he feels inside. He is in a dark place. And who can blame him? I mean, consider his situation. Job's thinking out loud that if God had never allowed the day for me to be born, everything would be just fine. He keeps talking. Verse 7, he says, "Let that night be childless. Let it have no joy. Let those who are experts at cursing, whose cursing could rouse Leviathan, curse that day." Let me tell you, let me help you with something here. These experts at cursing that he's talking about, he's actually talking about people that today we would call fortune tellers and sorcerers. He's talking about, now he's not endorsing them. Get that? Don't get me wrong. He's not saying he believes in them. But this is how desperate his cry is. He's saying, those people who make a living cursing other people, I wish they'd just put a curse on the day I was born. I wish they would call some monster up from the deep and just swallow that day from the past so that I could never have existed. I'd just as soon never have been here. Have you ever been that distraught? Has it ever been so bad for you that you thought the only way you could get relief was to have never been born? You would take any way out if it was offered to you. Job continues. Verse 9. He says, let its morning stars remain dark. Let it hope for light, but in vain. May it never see the morning light. Another way to say this, he said, I'm sorry the sun ever came up the day I was born. I wish the light had never broken the horizon. He goes on. He says, curse that day for failing to shut my mother's womb, for letting me be born to see all this trouble. Now, listen carefully. Job's reaction is not uncommon. When you talk about somebody in intense pain and in extended suffering, when unexpected tragedy comes on somebody, it can cause anybody to lose their perspective. And when we lose perspective, we tend to over-exaggerate what we say. We don't really mean it, but this is what we are feeling in the moment. How many times have you or I said something like this? Nobody loves me. Nobody cares. This isn't worth it. I wish I could just die and get it over with. If I died, nobody would come to my funeral. Sound familiar? You see, Job's emotional state was one that was stepping into the arena of deep depression. And so he starts making this wish list, and his first wish is, I just wish I'd never been born. Well, since his first wish of never having been conceived didn't happen, he says, well, if I had to be born, then I wish I'd died at birth. Look at verse 11. He said, why wasn't I born dead? Why didn't I die as I came from the womb? And I want to point something out to you here. For the first time, Job asked God the question, why? Why? Unless you wondered, did you know Jesus asked God the why question one time? When he was hanging on the cross, he cried out to the Father, my God, why have you forsaken me? Let me tell you something, beloved. In a time of heartache and a time of suffering, it is a natural question to ask God. Guess what? He can handle it. But it's a question you've got to ask with humility and not with a demanding spirit. You ask it properly, and it's a plea for hope. You ask it improperly, and it's a demand for answers. I deserve, and no, you don't. It's like these lawyers get on television and said, you deserve this money. No, why do you deserve it? There's only one thing, according to the Bible, that we deserve. And we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to go there. And it's amazing to me that throughout this entire ordeal, God never did answer Job's why question. What God did do was He revealed Himself. So instead of answering why, God showed Job who. Instead of trying to give him a reason as to why he's enduring all of this ordeal, He told him, let me show you who will carry you through it. And let me try to illustrate it this way. Let's say you're climbing a ladder or doing something around the house, you fall off the ladder and you break an arm. And it's a compound fracture. I mean, the bone is completely broken in two. They rush you to the hospital and you are in incredible pain. They take you in, they do x-rays on the arm, they wheel you into one of those little cubicles in the ER room, and they leave you there for a while. And all you can do is scream because it hurts. Finally, the doctor comes in, and he's got developed x-rays, and he puts them up on that light board, they have in that room. He turns the light on, and he takes his pen out, and he begins to explain in great detail why the bone shattered here and here and in this way and this way and this way. This is why you're hurting so bad. You don't care. I don't want to know why. I know why I'm hurting. I want to know how to get rid of the pain. And why it hurts is the last thing you're concerned about. In fact, Warren Wiersbe said it this way. He said, I got it up here. He said, we don't live our Christian lives on explanations. We live them on the promises. It's not the why, it's the who. But in his despair, Job keeps asking why. Verse 12. Why was I laid on my mother's lap? Why did she nurse me at her breast? But Job, in his despair, is asking, why did all of this happen to me? Why did my mother take the steps to keep me alive only to have this happen? Boy, does that sound familiar? How many times have we said, why did this and this happen only for it to come out this way? Well, it's interesting. Job starts painting a layered picture here of what he thinks death would look like. This is how he would see it, and this is what he's praying for. The first thing he saw in death was he saw rest. Look at verse 13. He said, now, I would be lying down and quiet. I would be asleep. Then I would be at rest. If only I had died when I was born, I could have been placed in the grave and found rest. But instead of rest, I've got this misery. I've got torment. Yeah, man, death would be like an afternoon nap. Not only did he see it as rest, he saw it as a reunion. He talked about it would place him in the company of kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins from themselves, or with princes who have gold, who fill their houses with silver. He's saying, if I had only died at birth, then I would have proceeded right on into heaven, and I'd have been promoted to the same level as all the kings and princes who have died in years past. I'd already be there with them. Then he saw death as a relief. In verses 16 to 19, he writes these words. He says, oh, why was I not buried like a stillborn child, like an infant that never sees the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They do not hear the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slaves are free from their masters. Here's what he's saying. If I had only died in childbirth, I would have escaped all of this pain. I wouldn't be suffering like I am. And look at the comparison he makes here. He talks about the prisoners that are at ease with each other. In other words, death is like a jailbreak. I'd be free of this imprisonment of suffering. Well, practically speaking, right now, we are prisoners of this physical body. We are subject to suffering and pain, and we are imprisoned by our circumstances. And the only thing, let's be honest, the only thing that can truly release you from this prison is death. Because death will silence the voice of the slave driver. Pain's voice is stilled by death. In death, the prisoner no longer hears the voice of that cruel taskmaster of suffering. Everyone, great and small, is going to know this kind of relief on the day that they die, because it's going to free us up from any affliction. That's what's coming. But Job wasn't there yet. The first thing he said was, I wish I'd never been born. And when that couldn't come about, he said, well, then I wish I had died at birth. And since neither of those two things happens, he decided to address the present. He said, I wish I could die right now. Now remember, he's not talking about suicide. He didn't want to take his own life, but he was asking and praying God to take it. And there's a world of difference. Have you ever been in such sorrow that you said, I just wish Jesus would come back now and just deliver me from this trouble? You may have thought about it this morning. Well, that's where Job is. He's not contemplating suicide, but he would prefer to check out of life if he could. Perhaps you heard the story about the man who wasn't feeling well, and so they admitted him to the hospital to run a battery of tests. And when all the testing was over, the next morning, the doctor came in to talk to him about the results. And the doctor said, well, what do you want to hear first, the good news or the bad news? And he said, well, give me the good news first. And the doctor said, well, the good news is you've got 24 hours to live. Good grief, that's the good news? Then what's the bad news? And he said, the bad news is they were supposed to tell you yesterday. You see, this is Job's situation. The bad news would have been good news to him because he wanted to die, and he would have been happy to die today. I want you to see how low he was sinking. This is verse 20. Why is the light given to one in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it does not come, and dig for it more than for hidden treasure, who rejoices exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave? Now look here's what he wants to know. Why does God continue to give another day to the suffering? It almost seems to be cruel and inhumane punishment to let this keep on. If I could die, then it would be like discovering a treasure chest for me. If I could die, it would be the greatest thing I could find. That's despair. In verse 23, he goes on. He says, why is light given to one who cannot see the way, whom God has fenced in? Let me remind you of something. Earlier in the book, if you remember, Satan accusingly said that Job served God because God had built this hedge of protection around him. Remember? And God removed that protection. Well, now, God's allowing another hedge to be built around Job's life, but this one is keeping him from escaping. He's locked in. Have you ever had your troubles get so deep and so hard that there's nowhere to go? There's no escape? Well, that's where Job was. God had fenced him in with his problems, and he couldn't get out. There was no escape as far as he could see. He goes on, verse 24. He said, for my sighing comes like my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. Truly, the thing I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. Job couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about his sorrow and his suffering. There didn't appear to be any end in sight. There's no way out. Does it sound familiar? It may be where you are right now. But beloved, if so, take heart, because all is not lost. There is hope. And I want to share with you very quickly some of the steps you can take to overcome despair. Here's the first one. Recognize that even the strongest believer can become discouraged. Nobody is Superman. None of us. No one is exempt from discouragement. And I remind you, Remember, Job was regarded as the most righteous man on the face of the earth. God said, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's nobody like him." What he's saying is, Job is my Mount Everest. He stands taller than anybody else. Yet here you find Job in the deep valley of depression. I mean, all the markers are there. Gloom, anger, bitterness, confusion, fatigue, cynicism, fear, hopelessness, insomnia, dejection, sadness, pessimism. It's all there. So that opens up an interesting question. Can a follower of Christ be depressed? Well, let's see. Maybe we ought to ask that question to the Apostle Paul. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, he said, "We think you ought to know, dear brothers and sisters, about the trouble we went through in the province of Asia. We were crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure. And we thought we would never live through it. In fact, we expected to die." That's Paul? Doesn't sound like a whole lot of hope there, does it? You know what it tells me? Thank God Paul is just like me. Martin Luther, who's the father of the Reformation, said this. He said, "For more than a week I was close to the gates of death and hell. I trembled in all my members. Christ was wholly lost, and I was shaken by desperation and blasphemy of God." If it can happen to somebody like Paul, if it can happen to somebody like Martin Luther, then what would make me exempt? The second thing you need to realize is that you will suffer deeply on many levels at one time. I mean, look at Job. He was suffering physically. I mean, obviously, he's covered with sores. He was suffering intellectually because his mind is just being flooded with all these why questions. He suffers emotionally in his heart because he's so deeply troubled that he can't find any place of rest, and it's impacting his sleep. And he was suffering spiritually as well. He recognized God has now hemmed him in, and he's wishing I'd never been born. You see, there are times, beloved, you will go through a dark time of adversity and you will end up suffering physically, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually all at the same time, and it will touch you in the deepest corners of your soul. You can't escape it. The third thing you need to understand is that discouragement will cause you It will cause you to lose your perspective. You see, that's what has happened to Job. He's lost his perspective of God, and he begins to overreact and exaggerate his situation. And when you get to that point, you jump to wrong conclusions. You don't have sound judgment. See, this is what depression does. It distorts your entire view of life. It twists your perception of reality. It clouds your view of God and yourself, and it produces, as a result, unhealthy, negative images. You end up seeing life from an irrational perspective. You see, there's great danger in the captivity of depression. And people will make their worst decisions when they are depressed. You know, I tell people, when a person experiences the death of a spouse, or especially the death of a child, I tell them, try not to make any major decision for a year. Because it's going to take you that long just to begin to think clearly again. The next thing you need to do is don't keep your pain to yourself. Find somebody to share this with. You know, I think one of the biggest mistakes Job made was when his 3 friends came to comfort him, for 7 days they sat there and he didn't say a word. Job surrendered 7 days when he could have begun to pour himself out to his friends, and they could have gotten underneath the load with him and tried to help him. You know, Galatians says to bear one another's burdens. Romans says, weep with those who weep. Job should have opened up and shared his situation and his sorrow with his friends, and so should you. Don't keep it to yourself thinking that it's going to make you a more spiritual person. All it's going to do is make you a more wounded person. The next thing you need to do is remember this. God has a purpose behind suffering. You see, as long as you're alive, as long as you are drawing breath, God has a purpose for you on this earth. And up until the moment that you die, you are still in the process of fulfilling that purpose. That means that you and I need to stay here until God determines your job's done. Your time's up. In fact, here's how Jesus said it in John chapter 9. He said, we must act quickly. We must quickly carry out the tasks assigned us by the one who sent us. The night is coming, and then no one can work. Hebrews said, it is appointed unto men once to die, then the judgment. It's an appointment we've all got. God has put it on the calendar. It's not up to us. In the meantime, we work to fulfill the purpose until our appointment comes up. One more thing. When you are discouraged, did I not put this one in there? I'm sorry I didn't put this in there. I did. When you're discouraged, take these steps to avoid depression. Listen, discouragement and depression are not the same thing. But discouragement is a doorway into depression. Now I want to give you just a couple of suggestions how to shut that door. I went ahead and printed these out on your outline. It's too much here for you to try to write, but I want you to have these because these are keys that can spare you a lot of suffering. Here's the first one. Memorize and meditate on the Scripture. God's Word can soothe the troubled heart. Let God's Word be the balm of Gilead that you need. The second thing, listen to Christian music. Listen to songs that lift up Christ and elevate Him. Let His great name just bathe over you. Let me remind you, when Saul was troubled by that evil spirit, what calmed his heart? David playing the harp. And I got news for you. David wasn't picking out the top 40. He was playing songs of worship that lifted up the name of God. The third thing you need to do is stay plugged into a Christian fellowship. Don't isolate yourself. Let other people affirm you. Let somebody come alongside and support you. Let others help you carry it. You need to be around other people, and you need to laugh and enjoy life with them. As Charles Swindoll said, he said, the Christian life should include some outrageous joy. Amen. The next thing you need to do is find somebody else to encourage. See, a surefire way to work through your problems is to take your attention off of yours and start focusing on helping somebody else. And as you begin to minister to the need of someone else, you will actually begin to experience healing in your own soul. Find a prayer partner. Connect with somebody that you have confidence in, that you can pour your heart out to. Somebody that you know will keep a confidence. You know, there is something, it's hard to describe. There is something about hearing another person's voice pray over you. It just does something. Especially when you're in a time and a place that you can't pray for yourself. You want to talk about raising up a battered spirit. The next thing you need to do is remember this. God is sovereign. He's in control. He's always in control. And He allows suffering to accomplish a greater purpose that one day will be revealed to you. And know this, it is a purpose to bring glory to His name. Let me give you one more thing to do. Get regular physical exercise. Get out and take a walk. Go ride your bike. Go work in the yard. Go play around the golf. Unless the way you play golf adds to your depression. I don't know. But just know this. Physical exercise is critical. It has been proven that it releases endorphins into the body that actually raises your sense of well-being. Now like I said, there's a little psychology in this, but I think it's very biblical psychology because they're factors that God has given us to help us ward off these times of despair. Several years ago, actually back in the days of the great sailing ships, a ship in the South Pacific was caught in a terrible storm. It was blown out of the shipping lanes and the ship was lost. All the crew perished save one man. And he washed ashore on this small uninhabited island. There was no one else there but him. And in his desperation, this castaway began to pray to God for rescue. Every day he would scan the horizon looking for a ship, but to no avail. And as some time passed, he was able to build himself a crude shelter out of some of the debris from the ship that had washed up on shore. One day he went into the center of the island looking for food. There were some fruit trees and some things that he could eat. And as he was making his way back to his camp, he saw a plume of smoke rising. And as he ran to where his camp was, he found his little crude hut completely engulfed in flames. Everything that he had that could possibly help him was lost. He had nothing to help him survive. And his despair just overwhelmed him, and it turned into deep grief and depression. And for the next several hours, through the night, he was unable to sleep. And he began to question whether or not it was even worth trying to live. And so the next day, the day following the fire, he got up early and he decided, I'm just going to walk down to the shore. I'm going to walk out into the sea and into the surf until I disappear. But when he got to the shore, to his amazement, there about 300 yards offshore is this ship anchored and a lifeboat coming towards him. He was saved. And when this once lost sailor was taken aboard this ship and he met the ship's captain, all he could ask was, the thing he wanted to know more than anything else was, how did you find me? How did you know I was here? And the captain replied, we saw your smoke signal. As soon as we saw it, we turned the ship. It has taken us about 12 hours to tack back into the wind, but when we saw your signal, we turned around and came back to get you. And here we are. Listen, beloved, calamity may strike, but remember, God can use that calamity as a means of bringing a much greater blessing into your life. You know, this morning you may feel like your life's going up in smoke. You may find yourself in the heat of fiery trials. But you be encouraged, beloved, because your trial may be the very instrument that God is wanting to use to bring you closer to Him and to secure greater blessings from His hand in the future. You see, that's the reality that's taking place in Job's life. If you read the book, you're going to find out this is what happens as Job allows God to work this through him. Your time of testing will bring you closer to God than you have ever been before if you will trust Him. That's all I got. But there's not a greater message that you could hear. Every one of us. If you have never endured a trial, let me give you this word of encouragement. It's coming. A lot of you could stand and testify. And you could tell your own story of how in the worst situation you could ever imagine yourself being found, God came through. He carried you in the darkest times, and He delivered you back into light. So wherever you find yourself today, okay? Wherever it might be, whatever the situation, whatever the trial, however painful the sores might be, God knows where you are. He knows what you're going through. Remember, if you belong to Him, nothing has touched you that has not already passed through His hands. Wouldn't it be great if in the courts of heaven right now, God would be saying something like, have you considered my servant Dale? Or have you considered my servant Marie? They're a Mount Everest because they stand so tall. You can trust God's sovereignty. Let's just pray together. Father, we give you glory because of who you are. We give you glory because nothing comes to our life that you do not know and that you do not understand. Nothing happens to us that you do not allow. And I pray that if we find ourselves, Lord, in the throes of despair, if we are suffering and we can't seem to see an end in sight, if we have more why questions than can be answered, Lord God, I pray that in this moment we'll be able to not think about the why, but look at who. Look at who can deliver us. We bless your name and we pray that you just remind us this morning that we can trust you. Amen. I'm going to ask you to stand. We're just going to sing one verse of this great song. You may want to spend some time in prayer. I'm not going to apologize for running long today. But I want you to know that if you're in the throes of the struggle, you can trust God and He will deliver you. As we sing, if you